Welcome to the Gay and Lesbian History on Stamps virtual presentation of Why I Collect Hong Kong by Ingo Nessel. We're thrilled to have Ingo with us today. Is the Vice President at the Hong Kong Study Circle, past President of the Philatelic Specialist Society of Canada, and a Fellow of both the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada and the Royal Philatelic Society of London. Welcome, Ingo.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me talk to this group. I got to know you during CAPEX 22, and I just felt at home here. Even though I'm straight, I have lots of gay people in my life in terms of friends and even relatives. So I'm very comfortable here, and I like this group. So I'd love to share some of my philately with you. Just to begin, I'm going to do a little personal thing and dedicate this talk to my mother. Today is her birthday. She would have been 95, and I always have her in my mind. So why I collect Hong Kong is the title of this talk. I'm going to give an overview of the stamps of Hong Kong to start with, and we'll talk about things like treaty ports and branch post offices. There's lots of subspecialties in Hong Kong. Security markings and perfins are one of them. And then we'll go into postal history for a few slides. And then I'll get to the end of it talking about different clubs and societies that specialize in Hong Kong and all the literature that you can find. There's been a lot of stuff written about the different subspecialties of Hong Kong philately, and we'll end it up. So let's start with the map of China and a detailed map of Hong Kong. So there's China, and Hong Kong is on the south part of China, just a coastal city. It's actually an island. You see this little sort of shape here. That's Hong Kong Island. That's the main city. It's mountainous, and that affects a lot of things, including the postal history, which you'll see later. So all the population is sort of along this bay here and also on the south side, but in the middle of it, it's all mountains. Across this harbor is the whole reason for Hong Kong being what it is. It's one of the most spectacular harbors. It's deep water. It's secure from typhoons, and the British came there in the 1840s and claimed it, and it became a fabulous source of trade and business and wealth and population growth, and it's a fabulous city now. The northern part of it's all part of the Kowloon Peninsula, and there was a boundary about here where my cursor is showing, which became the new territories. And that was amalgamated into Hong Kong in 1897 and became what the whole territory of Hong Kong now is. In 1997, Hong Kong ceased to become a British colony and reverted back to China. And we'll talk a lot about that and the impacts on the stamps. To start with, I'm going to just talk quickly through the different definitive issues of Hong Kong. This image of Queen Victoria was created by a French-born British artist named Joubert, who designed that stamp, or that stamp is based on a design that he created, and a lot of British stamps have that similar design. And I'm talking about that because it's repeated in future stamps of Hong Kong, and it's incredible how consistent that design is. I consider it simplistically beautiful. It's just a very clean way of presenting the monarch. And in the up till about the King George times, till the 1930s, there was only monarchs on the stamps. That's all they did was show pictures of the kings or queens. So these were the ones. Queen Victoria had a long reign from 1862 to 1901, so there was a lot of these stamps issued as the rates changed. Sometimes the rates changed so fast that they couldn't get stamps sent in from Britain, so they had to do overprints, like this 10-cent on 30-cent one. And you get a lot of varieties with those overprints, and they have watermark varieties. There's a lot of stuff going on in Hong Kong Victorian stamps, but it's the expensive side of the hobby. They also, because they had so much commerce, they sometimes ran out of stamps and authorized fiscal stamps, revenue stamps, to be used for postal purposes. And that's a feature of the Victorian era. And they did it once again in the 1930s when they ran out of 5-cent stamps and authorized revenues to be used for postal use. This middle one here, the $3 one, I'm very proud of it because it's nicely centered. These stamps are notoriously poorly centered. So it's nice to have an example that's that well centered. Now we're into King Edward VII era, 1903 to 1911. He had the same fate as our current King Charles III, where his mother had a very long reign and stayed alive for a very long time. And so he was in his 70s when he became king, just like Charles III now. So he had a short reign because he was already old and just lived for 9 years as king. Because of the shortness of the time, there's not a lot of variety in this definitive issue. There are 3 different sets. They're all the same design. They introduced 2 colors in their stamps at this time, and it's kind of an era that not a lot of people specialize in, but it's for those of us who want completeness and one of each, it's still something to hunt and peck for. Now we've moved to George V, 1912 to 1937. This was when Hong Kong became very prosperous. The trade and the business and the shipping, and it being the gateway to and from China. This was the era where it really grew up into a major international power and a big star of the British Empire in producing revenue and wealth, both locally and to the home country. In China at this time, there was a lot of upset and revolution and terrible things going on. In the 1920s, after the Republic of China was created and the old Chinese monarchy was abolished, they went into a kind of civil war with warlords in different parts of the country fighting each other. There was a lot of instability. And then in the early 30s, the Japanese decided they wanted to get a piece of the action. So they invaded northern China, which is Manchuria, and the Japanese just took over a large tract of China. So that was a thing that caused Hong Kong to benefit from all that upset and war. So these stamps were, they just had this issue in two different watermark varieties. I'm obviously not showing all the values of the set, just to give you a flavor of this things. But again, it has a pretty similar design to the earlier ones. And you notice these bottom ones here, the China overprints. Because of all the problems in China, there was a lot of inflation. And if you were buying stamps in the treaty ports, like in Shanghai or in Canton, the value of the currency there was so low that it was possible to speculate by buying the stamps cheaply there and then coming to Hong Kong and selling. So to prevent that, they overprinted Hong Kong stamps with the word China, and they were to be used from 1917 to 1930 in the treaty ports only. And our member and my dear colleague and friend Ian Gibson Smith is a specialist in that issue. He has a fabulous website about it and has won some pretty high prizes displaying it and exhibiting it competitively. George VI. I call this guy my king because I was born during his time. I draw your attention back to that Joubert design, and you see that simple, straightforward, just the head and the Chinese writing on the side and the English writing on top and bottom. It's a super clean, simple design. I just love graphics, and this to me is a perfect example of very effective graphics. Again, I don't show all the values of the set. The lower values are single colors, the higher values are bicolors. And there was a complaint at the time that they only showed the currency in written in alphabetic writing rather than showing numbers, so that if there was anybody who was illiterate, they wouldn't know what the value of the stamps are. But anyways, that was a complaint that they changed in Queen Elizabeth's time. There are some really interesting varieties to collect in this issue, including some pre-production material like this block of imperforates issued on blue paper. They also issued these with specimen perforations. So that is when they produce a new set of stamps, they either overprint or perforate it with the specimen, which they send out to all the UPU countries to let them know, okay, Hong Kong has issued these stamps, so you can accept their mail, and these are legitimate stamps. And it's always nice to get a complete set of specimens. We're moving on to Queen Elizabeth's, our late monarch. Her reign obviously lasted from 1953 to 2022, but from a Hong Kong point of view, it only lasted till 1997, because 97 was the year that Hong Kong reverted to China. Mm-hmm. So that the Elizabethan era of Hong Kong is that abbreviated time of Elizabeth's life. Again, I'm pointing out the Joubert design of the first issue, the Wilding issue here. What a wonderful sequence to go from the 1860s to the 1960s and have the same principal design. But that was the end of it. After that, in 1962, they adopted a portrait of the Italian-British artist Annigoni, who painted her riding a horse in full regalia. And that is a beautiful, beautiful picture of a beautiful lady who was queen. And Hong Kong used that portrait for their definitives from 62 to 73. In 1973, they changed the image again to be the Machen head. This was a Arnold Machen. If any of you collect Great Britain stamps, the Machen series is well known and was used for a long time. This bust of her head was made by Machen, but it isn't the same one that is on the British stamps. It's without a crown and a laurel wreath instead. They continued using that Machen portrait from the 1982 to 87 definitive issue. This one featured the lion on the left and the dragon on the right, which is the Hong Kong coat of arms. Then from 1987 to 92, they did a new revised Machen issue. I consider this a very beautiful one. There's a lot of nice color combinations here, and the way they fade the color from very deep to very shallow, and then very light, and then with the Hong Kong architecture at the bottom. It's a beautiful composition. And then the last Elizabethan issue shows the Machen portrait with the crown. This is the same portrait that they used on the British stamps, the Machen issue, and that lasted for those 5 years till Hong Kong reverted to China. So there's some great varieties in the Elizabethan era in their definitive issues, if you want to get into detail. One really spectacular one was for the Machen issue, the Wilding issue in the 1950s. There was, these were printed in sheets of 100. And there was one time when a couple of sheets, the perforation machine missed and only hit the bottom row of 10 stamps. So for 2 sheets, there were 90 imperforate stamps. So there's 180 of these extant. And I was very lucky to get a pair. And I have another exhibit on that very variety where I have a block of 4 with the requisition number. I haven't included that in this roundup of Hong Kong stamps because it's very specialized. But anyways, that's a cool variety to have. Then you got things like printing flaws. This has a on the king's on the lion's head. They have a little horn sticking out there. I bought that one, and I've been looking for it on cover, and I've gone through thousands of these. This is a pretty unique thing. It might be a one-off. And now we get into what I call the bridge definitive issue. These were issued in Hong Kong at the beginning of 1997. The handover to China was on July 1st. So these stamps were already being used during Queen Elizabeth's time in Hong Kong, and then they continued into use to the time when they reverted to China. And you notice there's no Queen's head or royal cipher or anything there, and this was the beginning of the end. It is an attractive issue. It's got the skyline of Hong Kong on the high values and the low values with some really nice pastel colors. And because they were issued c'est tenant in these souvenir sheets, you can get some nice c'est tenant franking varieties on cover. And then in 1999, a couple of years after Hong Kong reverted to China, they said, okay, let's have our own issue now. And they made up a really nice one of Hong Kong famous landmarks. If you visited there, some of these will be recognizable. They have lots of bridges and sailing boats and ferries and stuff in Hong Kong. So, and some great European style architecture, as well as Chinese symbols and statues. This issue only lasted for about 3 years when they changed it to, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful definitive issues, Hong Kong East and West. So each stamp has 2 sections, and you can see, let's take this one. And here they have the forks of the Western culture and the chopsticks of the Eastern culture, and so on and so forth, and all these images. This was a really, really beautiful set. It was only in use for about 5 years. And as much as I like the images and the colors and the designs of these, collecting them used is a bit of a challenge because of all that multicolor. It's very hard to read the cancels. But anyways, it's a nice issue. After that, in 2006, they decided to go with birds. It's a really nice set too. Again, I'm just showing a few examples of it. And that was in effect for a longer time, for about 8 years. They had 2 printings, and it's a fun one to collect, but we haven't found any great varieties of it yet. And now the current definitive issue that's been in effect for a really long time is called the Hong Kong Global Geopark, which is basically showing images of Hong Kong's nature. Even though it's a bustling city and a lot of population, the population now is around 6 million, there is a lot of land in Hong Kong and a lot of nature, and that's what they feature in these definitives, these current ones. So I'm going to go to Hong Kong commemoratives, and there were commemoratives before these ones were issued in 1941, but they were, for the most part, omnibus issues like the Silver Jubilee and Royal Wedding and all that stuff. So those I didn't want to show in this. I wanted to showcase this particular issue of 1941 when they celebrated 100 years of being a British colony. And first of all, the designs of the stamps and the color combinations are really spectacular, in my opinion. And look at the engraving of this. I don't know how well you can see that, but that Hong Kong street scene is so evocative of what it's really like there. The merchants on the street and going up the stairs, up the hill. It's really a beautiful stamp. And another feature of these stamps that they threw in, just brilliant design, are these little bats. These are representations of bats, and each stamp has a few of them. This one only has 2, this one has 4, and so on and so forth. You got to hunt and peck for them sometimes, but they're all there. And the reason they put in bats, in Chinese culture, the bat is a symbol of wealth and prosperity. And what the British wanted to do is say, you know, you've been a colony for 100 years, but look at how rich you are and how wealthy you are and how prosperous Hong Kong is since we've been here. So, and it's true to the extent that a lot of Chinese and a lot of Hong Kong citizens did get a lot of, better life and in some cases great wealth through the colonization. It was a very beneficial thing. Now we're talking about more recent commemoratives. Well, this is not that recent. I'm showing my age, but 1960s and 1970s commemoratives. They started doing an annual Chinese New Year stamp commemorative in 1967, beginning with the year of the ram. From that issue, it wasn't the same design. It was always a different design of the animal. So 74 was the year of the tiger. I love cats. That's my favorite animal. And these beautiful tigers are so nicely represented on those Chinese New Year stamps in 1974. This Seacraft commemorative issue from 1968, it's a strange combination of sort of just bland graphics and not very super detailed fine engraving work, but the colors are wonderful. And there's some great varieties to collect in this because some of the crowns have flaws in them. And also there's some of them with missing colors. So it's a great little issue that came out, and it's a very, in my opinion, a very colorful, beautiful issue. And then we continue with 70s and 80s commemoratives. The Star Ferry is one of the symbols of Hong Kong for tourism. By the 1970s, tourism was one of the biggest revenue makers for Hong Kong. Manufacturing and business and banking and all that continues to be a major thing, but tourism started to get big in the 70s and continues to grow until the 2000s. And the symbol of tourism in Hong Kong is the Star Ferry. That little channel between Hong Kong Island and Kowloon is about a 10-minute ferry ride. And that ferry is one of the greatest bargains in tourism in the world. When I was last there in 2014, it cost 70 Hong Kong cents, which is the equivalent of 1 US cent, to take the ferry ride from Hong Kong side to Kowloon side or the other way. And they run continuously. They go back and forth all day. There's 3 boats and they all keep the line going. And people use it. They use it when they're doing business travel. They use it for tourism. They use it for just getting off the hustle and bustle of either Kowloon or Hong Kong and being out on the water in that beautiful harbor for a few minutes and having a great little breeze of fresh air. They started with souvenir sheets in 1975. Lots of Chinese festivals occur throughout the year, and this was a souvenir sheet of 3 stamps that featured some of the festivals. And the Dragon Boat Festival, that's a Chinese tradition, is the racing of the dragon boats. And then here's the first set of the new style of Chinese New Year issues. So every year they came out, and they made, for this series of 12 years, they had them all in a similar style of design. Very colorful and a lot of fun. I'm into the 1980s and 90s here. This is getting closer to the time when Hong Kong was reverting back to China. Nothing exciting. Well, I can talk about the Peak Tram a little bit. Because Hong Kong is on a mountain, and you could see that here, buildings trying to reach up to the side of the mountain. But when you get really high up, it's It's only the mansions of the super wealthy that live there. And so they built in the 1880s, they built a tram. They call it a tram. It's actually a cog railway. And it takes you up right to the top of the peak of the mountain. And when you're up there, you could see this scene of the Hong Kong harbor. It's a beautiful little thing. And again, it's not an expensive, actually, it's not expensive at all. It's free. You just get on and it takes you up there and you can get off wherever you want. Hong Kong is a good example of how free trade and low taxes create a lot of wealth. It's a country that has not exactly a flat tax rate, but essentially business and individuals pay between 15 and 18% tax, and that's it. Nothing else, no sales tax, no hidden charges, nothing. And because it's so low, nobody cheats. So the government doesn't get cheated and doesn't have to do all these stupid things to get people to pay their taxes. And they also have free trade. Since the time that the British opened them up, they made trade very amenable and free without lots of, again, taxes and fees and everything. And so that's why that country prospered so much. Getting into the special administrative region era with commemoratives, it started to get busy. In 2005, they started issuing really a lot of commemorative stamps, but some of them were very clever. Like this one of the ABCs, it's $1.40 for each one of those stamps, which was the local postal rate at the time, $1.40 Hong Kong. And that was a wonderful way for the post office to get a lot of free money, because people would send letters to each other spelling out their names and way overpaying the postage, but having a lot of fun. So I think it was a very effective way to get people involved in stamps at the time when the internet was starting to take over our lives. In 2010, they started issuing a new series of Chinese New Year stamps, and I just show one example with my favorite tigers on it. And now we're getting into the 20 teens, and the stamps are getting more prolific, and they're talking more about arts and innovation and technology and that kind of stuff. They did issue postage dues in Hong Kong. The first set was this beautiful design of the scales of justice with some weights and a letter being represented that we need the justice of the correct postage rate being charged, and if somebody underpays, we have to charge them postage due. This design was in effect for about 56 years, 1923 to 87, and it's got a lot of complexity of different colors and different issues and different watermarks over the years. So it's if you want to dive into postage dues, Hong Kong is a great place to do it. In the 1980s, they changed the design to something very vanilla. They were in effect for a long time, but this was a time when they used postage due stamps less and less. They still charged postage due, but a lot of times it was collected through a meter or just in cash, and you don't find these used very much. And then the last issue they issued of postage dues are essentially just for stamp collectors. You will not find these used on covers, or if you do, tell me about it, because I haven't found one yet. All right, let's talk a little bit about treaty ports. Just want to do something here. Okay, so treaty ports. What is a treaty port? This map will show you the different ports that the British convinced the Chinese to allow commerce to take place. China was a closed country until 1840, and they didn't want to do business with anybody outside. They had a civilization that was 5,000 years old. They didn't need the rest of the world to tell them how to live their lives. But of course, European and American interests decided, well, there's got to be a lot of wealth there, so let's get in on the action. and they bullied them, basically. There was a few wars. You couldn't invade China. It wasn't like the British taking over India. There was no such thing. But they did bully them through these couple of opium wars into conceding some what they called treaty ports. So they made a treaty that allowed these major coastal port cities to have British and other foreign French, German, and American legations, consulates, and with that, business communities. Canton had a whole section of the city dedicated to the business community, as did Shanghai, as did a lot of those places. And you'd have foreign settlements within those cities. And the Hong Kong Post Office, in the case of the British treaty ports, the Hong Kong Post Office's stamps were sent to them, and they sent letters from these treaty ports. And they had cancellors and obliterators that canceled the Hong Kong stamps with their name. And those treaty port canceled stamps are really fun to collect. There are a few really scarce ones. There was also one treaty port in Taiwan and Formosa, super rare. And there was 3 ports in Japan, Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama, that had treaty port concessions. And those are also very rare. So I give a few examples of what those cancels look like. For some reason, my thing isn't advancing very well. I don't know why I'm stuck here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so here's some examples of treaty port cancels. At the beginning of the treaty port system, they had alphanumeric obliterators. So this one, it's a bit hard to see, but this is S1, which is Shanghai. And this one is F1, which is Fuzhou. I'll show you that on the map. There's Fuzhou, and there's Shanghai. And so let's say Swato was S2, Canton was C1, Hankou was D28. They had all these different obliterators, and some of those stamps canceled with those alphanumeric obliterators are very scarce and very valuable. And then sometimes they just had the name shown. So Amoy, Canton, Ningbo, and Chifu. These were all treaty ports and wonderful collectible cancels on Hong Kong stamps. Now I'm going to talk about branch post offices. And I'm showing the map again, which has a lot of the suburbs of Hong Kong shown, like Stanley, Aberdeen, Kowloon, Kwun Tong. All these places ended up having post offices. So as Hong Kong's economy grew, the population grew, and in 1898 there was enough business and mail volumes to warrant a couple of branches to be open. One was in Kowloon, and one is, they called it Western Branch. It's now called Sheung Wan. It was just a little bit west of Central. Central is the commercial center of Hong Kong. And those were the first 2 branch post offices in 1898. In the early 1900s up to World War II, a lot of places in the remote parts of Hong Kong, in the new territories and on the islands and so on, they didn't have enough business to warrant building a post office. So what they did, they were very clever. They used the police posts. They supplied them with stamps and cancellors and made them into branch post offices just out of the police post. And those stamps canceled with those police post branch post offices are extremely challenging to find and extremely expensive when they come up at auction. After World War II, there was a big population increase. First of all, during Japanese occupation from 1941 to 1945, the population of Hong Kong went from about 1 million down to about just around 500,000. Because people, first of all, there was a lot of mass killing, and secondly, people left and went to their homes in mainland China just to escape the Japanese. So the city suffered a lot. But then after World War II ended, it really quickly built itself up. A lot of people returned from their mainland homes. A lot of business came back, and manufacturing took off. Tourism came in, and the city grew very rapidly till today. It's a population of about 6 million. And with that growth of population, they needed post offices all over the city. And in fact, by the time of Queen Elizabeth's end of her time as Queen of Hong Kong in 1997, there's about 180 post offices, branch post offices. So that makes it a really interesting challenge to collect, because those branch post offices have their own cancellations. Here's an example. And that's something to really hunt and peck for in Hong Kong postal history, and just finding stamps with town names. I did do a exhibit a long time ago on branch post offices, and this is one page of that exhibit. But it's a fascinating area. You can really spend a lifetime just trying to get all those 180 odd branch post offices canceled on Hong Kong stamps. Here's an example of a cover with one of them from Stanley. An interesting little social side story to this cover. It's addressed to the Voice of the Philippines. It's a radio station, KZRH. And it's going to the Nighthawk, who's probably a DJ, and requests. And people used to send in requests to the radio stations. Can you play this song for my girlfriend or my boyfriend or whatever? And, it's just nice to have a little bit of social history on a cover. And then we have something called security markings, which is another whole area that if you want to go down a rabbit hole, the stamps of Hong Kong up until about the 1950s had either perfins, meaning perforated initials, like this one, which has an NCH perforated into it, standing for the North China Herald, which is a newspaper based in Shanghai, or company initials or even company names spelled out. So this one, CBIA, is the Chartered Bank of India, Australia, and China. When I started collecting as a kid, these kind of marks on stamps were denigrated, and especially perfins. They were considered damaged stamps, and people threw them away or discarded them or didn't collect them. And then suddenly, in the 1980s, a light went on and people realized, okay, this is history. This is commercial history, and it's interesting, and let's start trying to collect it all. So there's a group it's an online group called the Hong Kong Security Marking Study Group that lists all the companies that there are. And you know what? There's 1,500 of them. So this is another place where you could just go on forever collecting varieties and trying to get one of each. And I'll show you how I do it. I stick to my king. My king is King George VI, and I collect all the perfins I can find in King George VI. And that website on security markings shows that there are only 9 companies, because by the 1940s and 50s, when this issue was out, there was only 9 companies left that were doing perfins on their stamps. And so I'm trying to get all the perfins from the King George VI stamps that I can. And this is an example of the company called the Banque de l'Indochine, the Indochina Bank. They had branches in Hong Kong, and they perforated their stamps with the big BI, very simple, easy to read. And I'm trying to get the BI perforation on all the stamps of the King George VI issue. Not an easy challenge, but again, a lifelong pursuit if you're into it. Now let's talk a little bit about postal history. So in postal history, the challenge is to find interesting covers that illustrate routes, rates, special markings, destinations, and any kind of associated history with the cover. To start with, I'm just showing a few exotic destinations. Liechtenstein is one of the smallest countries in the world. Not a lot of mail from Hong Kong to Liechtenstein, but this is one going in 1979 to the Philatelic Bureau of Liechtenstein. So it's probably somebody paying for some purchase or making an order for a new purchase of stamps from Liechtenstein, a collector in Hong Kong. This one is going to a very remote island in the South Atlantic Ocean, Ascension Island, a British, it's not really a colony, it's a British military base. And they have a small contingent of military men and some support staff and a small population there. And that's it. So there's not a lot of mail that goes out there. So this is to show that postal history doesn't just have to be old stuff. It could be very modern. We're talking 70s and 80s here. But if we want to get to old stuff, here's an 1898 cover going to Cuba. Cuba isn't a super scarce destination, although you don't see a lot of it from this era, from 1898. This cover has a really cool story. So first of all, the postal history side of it, it's a 10-cent franking, which is the single rate for surface letters to Cuba from Hong Kong. And there's all kinds of routing markings on the back. The way it went was it went across the Pacific Ocean to San Francisco, and it was supposed to go by train via New Orleans to Tampa, Florida, from where it would take a boat to go to Cuba, etc. But in San Francisco, they missent it to Sacramento, and it has this beautiful marking there, missent to Sacramento, California. We don't know if it went back to San Francisco, if it was unforwarded. There was supposed to be a direct train service from Sacramento to Tampa, but it wasn't. It didn't make that service, so it went via New Orleans. Anyways, it ended up in Havana, and then from there it went overland to the final destination, which is a smaller city on the south coast of Cuba called Cienfuegos. So that's the postal history of this. It's an interesting routing story and transit time and all that and the markings. But there's also a historical and social history aspect to this. I was wondering, why would a Chinese merchant, this seems to be a merchant company with that seal they have for their company name, Xing-On, why would a Chinese merchant be sending a letter to somebody in Cuba? And what were Chinese people doing in Cuba? Because it's actually obviously going to San Wo Long y Compañía. It's going to probably a trading company in Cuba. So China to China, I studied a little bit of the history of it, and it turns out that in China provided a lot of labor for countries all over the world, and there were merchants or agents who supplied labor. And in Cuba, the main industry was sugarcane and also tobacco, and it was a very labor-intensive thing. And the Chinese would provide labor and send all kinds of workers there to work the fields or the tobacco industry. And so there was a contingent of Chinese living there all over Cuba. And then you go to the date, okay, 1898. What was happening in 1898? Well, in Cuba, there was a civil uprising against Spanish colonialism. Cuba was a Spanish colony at this time. And it was in 1898 that the United States entered into a war with Spain called the Spanish-American War. And the Americans helped Cuba get rid of Spanish colonialism. But it turns out that it wasn't just the Americans. Some of the Chinese workers there were sympathetic to the local Cuban, what we would now call freedom fighters against the Spanish, and they fought alongside them. And to this day, there's a statue in downtown Havana that celebrates and recognizes the contribution of the Chinese in the 1898 War of Liberation to help them become an independent country. So a lot of history from this one little letter that was missent to Sacramento, California. Not as extensive a story here, but again, Chinese labor being placed in some really remote places. This is a place called Middle Congo, part of French Equatorial Africa, that did issue their own stamps. So it's a destination. Nowadays, that country is just called the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's addressed to un travailleur chinois, a Chinese worker, number 596, Mr. Lo Wang Chi. So you can just imagine that here's a guy who's signed up for some work in either the mines or the forests of Congo. The mining and lumber were the main industries there, and the Chinese provided laborers there. And these laborers were literate; they were receiving mail. So it's an interesting insight into how Chinese diaspora went all over the world and with their labor and with their commerce. This is a more recent cover, 1956. It's in the time of Queen Elizabeth, but these two George VI stamps, two 8-cent stamps, make up a 16-cent rate, which is a penny overpaid for the 15-cent printed matter rate. It's a wholesale price list going to a company in Michigan, and it's just nice to have a late usage of king after the new monarch is in. But there's another interesting thing here, this slogan. If you could read that, it says, "Is your radio licensed?" So I was wondering, what the hell are they talking about? Is your radio licensed? Well, in the British world, radios were considered government regulated things that had to have a license. You had to have a license to own and operate a radio. And even in the 1950s, they still had that. It wasn't a lot of money. You just paid like 10 or 15 bucks a year, and you got a piece of paper saying you paid that money, and you could operate a radio. So they had to go to the extent of putting on a postal slogan to encourage people to keep paying for their license for their radio. It was around this time that the transistor radios came in, I think a little bit after this in the 60s. And it was transistor radios that have finally took away the need to license radios because they were so prevalent and could just be carried around, and they couldn't control people using radios. But if you think about it, needing a license to operate a radio, how anachronistic is that? And just one more cover, really, really scarce 1992 cover going to the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, otherwise known as North Korea. There is not a lot of mail that goes there in the first place, but for a cover to come back out of there, I bought this thing at a dealer in Singapore when I was on a business trip there, and I'm really glad to have a cover going to North Korea. I haven't seen any others from Hong Kong. So we'll talk a little bit about the literature. Because there's so many subspecialties of Hong Kong, as I outlined, there's a lot of people who have written about it. First of all, there's specialized catalogs. Stanley Gibbons has one dedicated just to Hong Kong philately. There's others. There's a fellow named Colonel Francis Webb, who in 1961 published the Bible of Hong Kong, postal history and stamps up to that time. There were a lot of developments from 1961 into the 90s and early 2000s, and Edward Proud produced the next book that would now be called the Bible of Hong Kong Philately. Then there's a bunch of guys who issued books on the definitives and books on the airmails. And the late Mr. Ming Chang from Philadelphia published about 6 books on things like the Japanese occupation and the postal history during that time, fakes and forgeries. And also one thing that I do have a lot of interest in registration labels. The registration labels of Hong Kong, with all those branch post offices, is a whole other rabbit hole you can go down if you want to get into postal history, registered letters. A lot of these publications are available at various libraries. The one closest to my home and my heart is the Harry Sutherland Philatelic Library here at the Green Foundation in Toronto. But you can probably get these also at the APRL or even the Rocky Mountain Library in Colorado. I don't know if there's any West Coast libraries, but anyways, there's philatelic libraries that carry all these books, and if you get into Hong Kong seriously, you'll get involved with that literature. Websites, there's every one of the societies that I'm going to show on the next slide has websites, and of course our own Ian Gibson Smith has a fabulous website on his China overprints. So here's some of the groups. The Hong Kong Study Circle is sort of the British-based group that did all the research to produce that first Bible by Colonel Webb. The Hong Kong Philatelic Society is started in the 1920s. It's local in Hong Kong, and they have a worldwide membership, but mostly local. And I joined them. Just they will accept membership from anywhere in the world. And between these two societies, we've got a lot of knowledge about the Hong Kong stamp scene. And then here's that group that I told you about, the Hong Kong Security Marking Study Group. They're one of those groups that there's no constitution, there's no membership fees, there's no meetings in any place. They're online, and everybody who is a subscriber contributes new findings on security markings, and we all share the knowledge. And that's a wonderful thing that you can do on the internet. The bottom thing is my group, the B62 group of Toronto. We are loosely associated with the Hong Kong Study Circle and the Philatelic Society. It's a group of people in Toronto who are passionate about Hong Kong, and we started in the late 80s, early 90s getting together, and we started to formalize it, at least with the venue at the Green Foundation office. And we have about 4 or 5 meetings a year and a nice Chinese dinner around end of the year to celebrate. And basically we just get together and show and tell, brag, and buy and sell and trade a little bit. So if you're ever in Toronto and you want to come to a Hong Kong group meeting, come join us and have some fun. So just to conclude, it's a small city, a small colony, but very challenging. When I first started collecting Hong Kong, I said, oh, hey, the catalog numbers only go up to 480. This should be easy. Well, boy, did I ever find out how challenging and complex it could be. It's very historically interesting, as I hope I shared with you, including the Canadian connection during World War II, when Canada sent a group of young boys there to try to defend the colony against the invasion of the Japanese, and all they got for it was either killed in action or 3.5 years of miserable prisoner of war time. So there is a Canadian connection there. Lots of postal history associated with that. It's got enough complexity, as you can see, to make it a lifelong pursuit. The fellowship of the societies is, to me, probably the most attractive part of it. I've made friends with people around the world and met wonderful people that have shared their love of Hong Kong as a city and Hong Kong stamps. Lots of excellent literature to study. And of course, my passion is lifelong learning. I believe that you never know it all and you can always continue learning. So this has a lot of opportunities for discovery and study. I'll say a last little thing about that beautiful image of Bruce Lee, the famous Chinese American actor. when I was last in Hong Kong, I was walking along the waterfront and they had a walk of fame. And they had little plaques either in the ground or on little stands of Hong Kong actors and actresses that I frankly had never heard of. And then in the middle of that whole thing, there was a little statue. It was a statue of Bruce Lee. Well, at all those plaques of Chinese movie stars, it would be one or two Chinese Hong Kong people looking at them and chatting and whatever, sometimes taking a picture. But when you got up to Bruce Lee's statue, there was a crowd. You couldn't get near it. Everybody loved and revered Bruce Lee. And I had to get a selfie of myself in front of him, having my arm around him. So that was a nice thing to have a world superstar movie actor from Hong Kong. Anyways, that's the end of my talk. I would say thank you for listening, and I will open up the talk to questions.
Ingo, I don't have a question, a comment. That was a really nice review of all the Hong Kong stamps. And I've listened to a lot of these kinds of discussions before, but you're the first person that really focused on the beauty of the stamp itself, which was really nice. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you for that. I like stamps because of their beauty. And we often sort of flippantly say stamps are miniature works of art, and it's true, but we don't really look at the intrinsic beauty of stamps. And I pay a lot of attention to the graphics. And I'll give a little plug to my Instagram. I have an Instagram called Just Beautiful Stamps. And all I do is roughly once every day or 2 or 3 days, I just post a picture of a stamp that I consider beautiful. And I don't say much about it. I certainly don't get into like technical stuff. I might say, hey, nice font, or love that 5 or whatever. And it's the beauty of the stamps. And so, yeah, thank you for noticing that, Carol.
You have some comments in the chat. Ellis Quan did say, for the birds definitive, I did buy a stamp with blurred color in the post office myself, but I have sold it to a Chinese bird collector some years ago. Ian asked, does anyone know how many branch offices London or other large cities have? This seems to be a rather huge number.
Yeah, I don't know. I know London had a lot, but not as much as Hong Kong, because it's that wide new territories that had a bunch of small towns in it that became branch post offices, and there's not a lot of cities that have that. It's a good question, though.
Ellis also commented, I think there's a stamp dealer in Hong Kong called Manny Flower who can supply you Hong Kong covers with North Korea as the destination, as we used to buy stamps there for decades.
Ooh, all right. Thank you, Ellis.
There's another association, the China Philatelic Association, since 1946.
I do want to point out it's completely illegal to buy anything from North Korea into the United States. And while you probably won't get into trouble, be aware it is completely and totally illegal. Okay.
But none of us will tell. None of us will tell.
Yeah. In Canada, we don't have that restriction, but definitely, yeah, North Korea is a bad actor, as we all know. So, and it's hard to get in there. It's hard to get stuff out of. I've heard that people wanted to buy, people who visit, they allow like a couple of hundred visitors a year there. And if you want to buy stamps there, they don't let you. They don't want, you can't take stuff out of there.
I did an exhibit on Capitol Hill about 20 years ago. One of the congressmen had some North Korea stamps and covers, and what was on them was literally North Korean soldiers bayoneting American GIs with the American flag to death with blood. I mean, that was on their actual stamps.
Yeah,
it's really messed up, some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Well, got a question here. Actually, a comment and a question. It's okay. I'll do the North Korea comment first. It's the circuitous way of getting North Korean stamps is to not import them directly from North Korea, but to go through a third country. So for example, maybe a French or Dutch dealer imports them legally, and then you can buy them from the French or the Dutch dealer. I've seen people do that. The other way too is that there's actually, they actually do want you to buy North Korean stamps in North Korea, so long as you pay in a foreign currency. They don't want you buying North Korean stamps using North Korean currency, but they want you to use foreign currency at certain shops that foreigners get to go to. And that way they get your US dollars or euros or whatever. And there's also a Korean stamp corporation that has email addresses in Moscow and Beijing. And if you write to them, they'll send them a lot list. They'll send you an email back, but they're kind of shady because I noticed their prices were a lot higher than what these Dutch and French dealers would ask for. So there are ways to get North Korean stamps. But anyway, that's North Korea. Ingo, got a question about Hong Kong. What stamps were used during do you know what stamps were used during the Japanese occupation? Did they use overprinted stamps of Hong Kong or Japan or whatever?
Yeah, really good question, Derwin. The time of Japanese occupation, they didn't use any Hong Kong stamps. Japan actually issued a small set of stamps that were for use in Hong Kong during that time. And they are scarce and they're expensive, and postal history is very, very scarce, and there's people who specialize in that. For me, because I like Hong Kong as a British colony, I consider the Japanese occupation a dark period, especially with the Canadian boys who suffered so much there. And I don't collect it. I know it exists. I've seen exhibits of it. I've studied, I've read books about it, but I have no interest to collect those stamps or those the postal history of the Japanese occupation. But they did issue Japanese, they look like Japanese stamps, but if you can read the characters, they are specific to Hong Kong during that time.
Okay.
Can I add a few words? The Hong Kong under Japanese occupation is normally there was for the covers there was a lot of forgery, so it is very hard to collect. And most of the covers at that time I used just Ingo said that there was a short set which with overpin Hong Kong, but it is very difficult to collect because, as I said, there was a lot of forgery, and though at those time the Hong Kong citizen doesn't have money or time to send covers. They don't have, they still have to earn a living. And so most of the covers that still exist are those philatelic covers sent by Portuguese stamp dealers.
Yes, a famous Mr. Henry Daluz.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. Yeah, there was a lot of weird stuff going on during the occupation. There was still philately, believe it or not, in a war zone where there's massive killings and everything. There was still stamp collectors around, but the things that happened there, they just turned me off so much. I don't care to collect that, but it's a genuine part of postal history too, and there's some pretty serious collectors of that stuff and exhibitors.
Okay, thanks. That's interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned that a lot of the covers of Philatelic seem to originate from a particular dealer. The same thing happened in Manila, in the Philippines. If you get a lot of the covers from Japanese occupied Philippines, all seem to be traced back to a particular dealer in Manila.
Yeah,
I think Theodore Sidal, I think, was one of the largest Hong Kong dealers, I believe.
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Ingo, can you read the characters on your postal history, the Chinese characters?
No, and that's a good question, Carol. That's one reason I don't collect China itself. China is another hugely complex philatelic area, but I chose very early on not to collect it, because if you can't read the characters, there's overprints and surcharges and varieties that you'd get lost pretty fast. One of my buddies from the B62 group, John Wilson, tried to learn Chinese. He said, I'm going to learn Chinese. I'm going to be an expert. And after a year of trying, it's a very challenging language for non-Chinese people. I respect the Chinese people so much for their language, because it's like, you know, we got 26 letters. They got 3,000 characters.
I did have a question regarding on one of the commemorative slides you showed, there was commemorative stamps of inclusive arts. What constitutes
Yes.
inclusive?
Yeah, I looked that up, and they have, what was it? It relates more to political stuff than societal stuff. Geez, I can't remember now what it was. I looked it up in the catalog, because let me see if I can find the images.
And while you're looking for those, I also really like the postage due stamps with the scale and the mail on one side being heavy. I thought that I collect mail on stamps, and I thought, oh, I like those also.
Yeah, I see in the chat one person is asking about LGBTQ rights, and that's a valid one. And I actually researched that a little bit before this talk. And what it is in 1991, there was a political agitation in the 1980s. And in 1991, both China and Hong Kong legalized male gay sex. The lesbian sex, for some reason, was never outlawed, but male gay sex was outlawed. That basically started in the 1840s when the Western world sent missionaries there. Missionaries screwed up their whole system because homosexuality was considered a normal part of life in Chinese culture. It wasn't, you know, I mean, in the 1840s, it wasn't very out, but it wasn't denigrated. And it was only from the missionaries and the Western ways that it was considered that they would, you know, that it's a bad thing. And so they had laws put in that outlawed homosexuality between men, but they never bothered to write it up for women for some reason. So like I say, in 1991, both China and Hong Kong legalized homosexuality, but in Hong Kong, being a Western style country with, I mean, it's an Asian country, but with some Western sensibilities from the long colonial period, they're more tolerant of it. In mainland China, it's on the books that it's legal, but you can't do pride parades, you can't flaunt it. It's basically, we don't want to talk about it. It's legal, but don't talk about it kind of thing. That's the way it is in mainland China. In Hong Kong, they do have pride parades, and they do, you know, they do have a little bit more openness about it. So I'm looking at these inclusive arts, and I can't read it because it's too small. Sorry. I got to look that up in the catalog. I can send you that if you want, Lisa.
Oh, no, I was just curious, and I like the little heart with the two people that were together.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was like, oh, does that go into our collection or not?
That's what I was thinking. And when I looked it up, there's no relation to anything gay or lesbian in there.
Ian has to go and says, thank you.
Okay.
Is there any other questions before we end the presentation? Well, thank you very much. We are thrilled, Ingo, that this is a very informative, colorful presentation. I'm going to stop the recording.